Welcome to Mining the Mysteries, a catechetical podcast that explores the depths of our Orthodox and Catholic faith in the English tradition. I'm Matthew Stewart, Digital Media Director for the Anglican Province of America, along with your hosts Father Wade Miller and Father Randall Russell from St. Philip's Anglican Church in Blacksburg, Virginia. We're glad to have you with us as we dig deeper into the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Welcome back, folks. We have another special episode this week, the challenge of forming godly young men. St. Dunstan's is a boarding school in central Virginia set to open its doors in the near future. The school seeks to educate and train young men who are entering high school by developing a rule of life, for example, Eucharist, morning and evening prayer, as well as reading the great books and learning a variety of skills in the trades. We have Father Mark Perkins, who is the Chaplain and Assistant Headmaster, and Mr. Thomas Fickley, who is the Headmaster and Founder. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you for being here. I know Father Miller has put together a series of questions for you two so folks can learn a little bit more about the school and what your mission is.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming in, and this is a treat to have you guys here. We've been wanting to do this for a while. I'd like to maybe get a brief bio of each of you and a little bit of your background, and then also how this vision came into being, and walk us through some of that. Thomas, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Father Miller. Really appreciate it. So I am a teacher by training. I studied history in college, in undergrad and in grad school, and taught for 10 years after that in boarding and day schools in central Virginia. And my passion is teaching English and history, and had a really good experience at both of my schools. I'll answer both of your questions at once here. A lot of what we're trying to do at St. Dunstan's flowed out of my experience teaching over those 10 years. Some of those were with Father Mark at the Covenant School in Charlottesville, which is a really wonderful school. But basically, we were observing what happened to some of our students who had, in many cases, really good churches, great families, a very coherent curriculum, really good faculty, good administration. So there are all these things going for them. And at the same time, they're turning out pretty anxious, frustrated, sometimes pretty bored. And what we realized through observing them and talking to them and talking with their families is that basically they were getting a very powerful counter formation from essentially the media and their peers to the one that they were getting from their churches and from their families. And so there was this kind of tension that they were living in, pulling them in different directions. And the metaphor we used at the time was we felt like farmers who were working really rocky soil uphill. We were doing a lot of the right things, but we just didn't have the right conditions to get the kind of formation that we wanted out of this education. So we started asking the question, what would it look like to start a farm in a better spot? How could we have better cultural soil to plant our students in so that their Christian formation can be a little bit more wholehearted and have some more integrity?
Well, that's good. Father Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I taught for 9 years, all at Covenant. During that time, I went to seminary as well, and then I served for 3 years as curate at St. Albans Anglican Church in Oviedo, Florida. And right after I moved down there, my friend Thomas Fickley, and former colleague at the time, called me and told me about his crazy idea. I did think it was a little bit crazy at first, but I had spent a few months on a farm in Germany after college, between college and grad school, and had loved the kind of human scale and rhythm of a traditional farming community. Almost all the fields were within earshot of the church bells, and most of them you could actually see the church bells sticking up above the tree line. So there was something really beautiful about a whole community oriented around the church. And my wife and I had been talking about homesteading for a while before moving down to Florida. And so St. Dunstan's was a natural answer to some of the dreams that our family had. I think that the other part of it is that in teaching, the other conversation that would happen in the teaching world is that every year you would have some conversation about boys in particular, and it's the boys of this class. Why are the boys of this class such knuckleheads? Why are they so teaching would be great if not for these boys. And by the time you've had that conversation about 8 successive classes, 27 times each year, you ought to, too many people don't, but you ought to start thinking there's probably not something wrong with every single male adolescent in America. There's probably something wrong with us, and us as a school, or us as a culture, or us as families. And so the anecdotal sense that we were doing something wrong in the way we were educating boys was part of the background that led me to think that the St. Dunstan's idea was such a good idea. And not to get ahead of myself here, but that anecdotal experience is backed up by a whole lot of research for a number of decades.
That's good. Yeah, that's great. My first question, it seems like there's classical schools popping up everywhere. And I think part of that is the concern with public education and how it's failed in many ways. So the obvious question that I'm sure you guys have been asked probably more times than you can remember, with all these classical schools and homeschooling on the rise, why a boarding school specifically for boys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of different answers, a lot of different reasons why a school for boys in particular, and a boarding school, is such a good idea. I think the question that we have focused on is, what are the conditions that are necessary for healthy flourishing for adolescents? And that has led us into considering the differences between boys and girls, and then what it is that boys in particular need. I think it's worth pointing out that to focus on the problems of boys is not to ignore the problems and difficulties that girls face. My 2 eldest, I have 2 daughters and a son, and my 2 eldest are girls. So I think a lot about their flourishing, about the challenges that American girls face. But when it comes to education, it is the case that boys struggle in ways that girls don't, that the current educational system tends to favor girls. Girls tend to flourish, or at least they tend to succeed on paper in ways that boys don't. So that's part of the answer. But it's not just that the current system doesn't serve boys, that there's a broader question about what boys actually need in order to flourish. And one of the things that almost every culture across time and space has concluded is that boys need rites of passage in order to grow into mature adulthood. And rites of passage in pretty much any culture, time, and place involve first the removal of a boy from the domestic home, then his initiation into his manhood through challenge, a challenge that can sometimes have a kind of funereal quality. The boy is dying so that the young man can emerge. And finally, the assimilation of that newly emerging young man into a set of peers and into an adult community. And this seems to be a particular need of boys. The classic example for us is that of our Lord. The story of the boy Jesus in the temple is, in fact, a story of removal from the domestic family, initiation through challenge, and then assimilation into his adult ministry and vocation. And just one short example to illustrate that. There's a lot more that we could say about this, but St. Luke refers to Jesus as either the baby or the child 6 times up until the story of the boy Jesus in the temple at the end of Luke chapter 2. Then he goes through this process of removal from the family, initiation through challenge and assimilation. And then for the first time in Luke's gospel, in Luke 2:52, we read, "And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." So Jesus leaves his boyhood behind through a process of removal, initiation, and assimilation. And again, virtually every culture that has ever existed has offered that to boys around adolescence, somewhere between the ages of 12 and 15. We're fairly unusual, if not unique, in not offering that to our boys. And I think that is that failure to honor and recognize adolescence and then to shepherd boys through it, through a sort of communally authorized, really set of, loosely speaking, liturgies. I probably wouldn't use that word too much, but ways of recognizing the underlying reality of what's happening in the removal from childhood and the growth into adulthood. I think part of the loss of that is part of what explains the sort of perpetual adolescence.
Right. And there are a lot of classical schools that have succeeded in restoring a coherent curriculum and a coherent methodology for helping students academically that have missed some of this sociological need, especially for young men outside of the desk in the classroom, to be challenged not only in his mind, but also in his body, to see some of his growing strength utilized for the sake of the community. A lot of classical schools have not made, I think, the distinctions that ought to be made between how adolescent boys and girls need to be taught differently. So one reason for starting a boys' boarding school is to lean into those particular sociological needs of young men. And then as a sort of a nice added benefit, there are plenty of homeschooling families and Christian families that don't have a large enough community of like-minded people nearby them to really run a flourishing classical school. And for a lot of those communities, a boarding school can be a kind of hub or nexus where you can get like-minded peers together, like-minded teachers to do something with a lot of resonance for all those different people.
No, that's good. Yeah. And I never really thought about well, of course, I have my oldest two are boys. I understand the sociological and the assimilation, but yeah, I never really, until you started talking about it, think about how profound that is, especially for boys as they're trying to sort through everything from hormones to pressure with peers and all of that. Yeah, no, that's very good. I've asked you this question before. Is there any thought down the road about I know this would be way down the road, but if this flourishes and really excels, anything in the thought process for girls down the road?
Yes, that's a common question. We'd love to see a girls' school happen at some point as a kind of sister school. That's a classic story in the Episcopal tradition. It's usually in the order that a boys' school is founded, and then sometime a few years later, a sister school is founded nearby. It would be different, and there'd be different sociological needs that girls have. But I do think that would be a good thing, and it's certainly something we'd love to see happen eventually.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I watched a movie that I loved called The Holdovers. Have you guys seen that, by the way?
It's been on the to-watch list for quite some time.
Okay.
Same.
It's a good movie. I don't endorse every single aspect, just so you know. But it is good. But in that, it's a boarding school in New England, and I'm not going to tell everybody the whole plot of it. But the gist of it is it's where wealthier people drop off their kids. And so when people think of boarding schools, sometimes they think of kind of an elitism or this is only for the wealthy. With St. Dunstan's, how does that work in terms of the financial component, and how can, let's say, somebody from Blacksburg here that would love to send their teenage boy, what resources, what kind of help can they get?
So I'll start out by answering that a little bit nuts and bolts logistically. Average boarding school tuition in America now is over $65,000 a year. And we are trying to make our price point closer to about $23,000, so somewhere around a third of the cost. Our model is built to be lean and very efficient. We're also partnering with churches from around the Eastern Seaboard to create scholarships for families who would love to send their kids. They're a good fit, but maybe don't have the resources. $23,000 is a lot of money. Now, compared to $65,000, it's not. But we're working on some ways to make it more affordable. Going back to the beginning of the question, though, with the holdovers, boarding schools in America have typically fit into three different categories. The one in the holdovers sounds like the kind of classic finishing school where you want your kid to go to Yale and they need to make the right networks and connections. They've got to know the right manners and take the right AP classes. It's basically a school for building a resume, right? St. Dunstan's is not a finishing school. It's just not our target. It's not that kind of classic college prep school. On the other end of the spectrum, some people think about boarding school as a place for troubled kids. This guy's not cutting it anywhere. He's basically one step away from juvenile detention. And the parents say, fine, we're sending you to military school, right? And so there are reform schools that were designed to add discipline to a kid's life. So the college prep school adds a resume. The military school gives some discipline. St. Dunstan's is neither of those two things. And this is a model that existed for a lot of the 1800s before compulsory public schooling brought more options to rural families. But we call ourselves a good life school. And the basic thing we're trying to add to young men's lives is a sense of wonder at the created order around them and a sense of just how much there is in God's world that's worth attending to and how many options they have for building a future. So we have a pretty heavy trades and farming component at the school to augment the classical education the boys will be getting in the liberal arts. We're not trying to make tradesmen. In other words, it's not a sort of Votech school. we're trying primarily to give the boys a sense of competence and a well-rounded life so that whatever they decide to do next, whether that's college, which they'll be well prepared for, or they maybe do fall in love with carpentry or farming or something like that, they can decide to pursue that as a vocation. Whatever it is, they'll have the sort of basic capacities and confidence they need to pursue whatever that route is.
Good.
Yeah, and I would just add that is one of the things is thinking about folks who can help support students who are good fits, but who can't necessarily afford it. Every good private school ought to say that tuition alone should never be the determining factor for a fitting candidate. And I think most schools that say that mean it. But if you have to put 200 seats, 200 butts into 200 seats in order to run your school every year, there's a certain limit to how much you can do. Our model requires 40, or doesn't require 48 is the peak of our students. So we need to find 48 boys who are a good fit. It's lean, as Thomas said. Every full-time staff member will be a teacher. We're not going to have any full-time janitorial or maintenance staff. That's the faculty and the students working together to take care of the campus. We're not going to have any full-time cooks who are just cooks. They're going to be a culinary arts instructor, and the boys are going to be doing the bulk of the cooking very quickly through that instruction. So that's the way we keep our model lean. And then we're hoping, again, to partner with benefactors and churches in particular to build scholarship funds for suitable boys.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. So some that are listening maybe come out of the Peter Lightheart tradition, Federal Vision, some of those kind of things where it's heavily the father is to be the shepherd of the child. And so there's some concerns or reluctance maybe about people sending their kids off because they feel like they're outsourcing their duties as parents. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first thing to say is that parents are indeed the first educators of their children, and that schools always act in loco parentis, whether it's a day school or a boarding school. You are teaching on behalf of the parents. And so that partnership with parents is extremely important. You have to be on the same page because you are authorized by the parents to offer formation on their behalf and in their place. And the place of fathers is particularly important. There's a couple of things, different ways of addressing this. The first thing to say is that everyone recognizes that you do have to send your children away. The sort of classic picture of the 35-year-old millennial living in the basement and playing video games all day. Everyone recognizes there's something wrong with that because he should be out of the home and living in some sense independently and contributing to his community and contributing to his parents, not continuing to be an economic drag on them. And so the question is not, should I send my boy away? The question is, when and how is the best way to send my boy away? And we in America have this, our sort of common sense answer, the sort of culturally unquestioned assumption, and at least among middle-class Americans, is that the fall after high school graduation is the right time, and sending them off to college is the right way. But we're very weird in doing that. We're really the first culture to make that the sort of time and place. We're probably the first culture in the history of the world in which a 17-year-old boy's daily routine and schedule and responsibilities is more like that of his 11-year-old little brother than that of his 19-year-old older brother. Even though a 17-year-old is biologically and in his physical development much closer to a mature adult than to a child. But his responsibilities and his routine are essentially childlike. And so our mission is not, I should say, to say, you need to kick that boy out earlier. It's that we want to lengthen the runway into adulthood. So we are a boarding school, and so there's a certain distance from parents, and yet we are acting in concert with parents to help raise their children. And so there's a kind of rhythm of helping to introduce that boy to the independence and responsibility that he needs to be a man, and yet also doing it under a sort of very carefully curated culture. So the other thing to say is that adolescents, both boys and girls, need more independence, freedom, and responsibility than ever before, because to be an adolescent is to be somebody who's leaving childhood behind, who's beginning to leave the home. But adolescents also need a more curated cultural context than ever before, because they're beginning to shift their primary sense of identity from their parents to peers and other non-parental adult mentors. Another way of saying that, there's the Roman Catholic educator and theologian Luigi Giussani, who says that up until adolescence, parents are handing down a tradition. That's what they do. They're giving their children a tradition. And he describes the tradition as a hypothesis about reality. What is the shape of human flourishing, and what does a good life look like? And then beginning in adolescence now are testing the tradition. And parental answers can no longer suffice to resolve the test, because parental answers are what's being questioned. And so now you have peers, non-parental adult mentors, who are forming essentially the proving ground to either prove or disprove the parental hypothesis. So we partner with parents.
Right. And there's the sort of classic example of what this looks like is a 16-year-old comes home from school and says, "Mom, Dad, guess what Father Perkins said in class today? Isn't that brilliant?" And Dad says, "I've been saying that every day for the last 4 months. Why didn't you listen to me?" Now, Dad's answers are not the thing that the child's trying to take in. They're trying to find out, are Dad's answers the right answers? I think a lot of parents we've talked to have had an experience that's like that. So in a way, it's not that Dad should not be part of the child's upbringing anymore. It's that Dad is bringing more people alongside to bolster and strengthen the vision of reality that we've been trying to pass on to our kids. So it's not an instead of Dad at this point. It's what other people does Dad want to bring alongside him to help continue forming his kids, if that makes sense.
One of the ways that we think about our program is we want to give, as I already said, we want to give adolescents maximal independence and responsibility. So we have a 176-acre campus, so they have a really big backyard and a lot of woods to explore. And we're going to give them, they're going to be building their own buildings, and they're going to be growing their own food. So that's a lot of responsibility. It's also a lot of freedom and independence relative to a sort of standard suburban day school life. But they also need more curated context. And so that's, for example, why we are going to ask the boys to live, we'll talk about this maybe later, but to live under a rule of what we're calling digital poverty temporarily when they're on campus. And that's in order to allow the church and the families and the faculty, those voices, to have a louder voice than pop culture, which has a very loud voice. It's not that we're shutting out the world. We can't do that, but we want to rebalance the culture of our school in that way.
Turn down the volume knob, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's good. So a question, if you have 48 boys, young men really, learning, and which sounds amazing, they're learning trades, they're reading the great books and all that, how do they get plugged into a local parish? What is it that how do you guys do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that we have answered that, going back to the German village I remembered with the church bells sticking above the woods, is that we wanted to build a school around a church. And so St. Dunstan's Academy has a chaplain, that's me, and I am licensed by my bishop, your regular guest, Bishop Chad, to serve as the chaplain for the school. And the chapel is going to function as the parish church for the boys, for the faculty, families, and for any in the community who choose to make St. Dunstan's their church home. So we are essentially also planting a church in rural Virginia that will be open to the community. And in that way, the boys' lives will be oriented around the church. So we'll begin every day with morning prayer. We'll end our days with evening prayer in the church. The climax of life together will be the Sunday Holy Communion. And so their lives will be literally, again, oriented around the church in a very tangible and real way.
Oh, that's good. This next question, I think 25 years ago would have been much more relevant than it is today. But accreditation, I don't know the first thing about that. Probably some of our listeners do. What's involved in that, or is that even on your radar?
So private schools sometimes do and sometimes don't pursue accreditation, and there are really two main purposes for pursuing that. One is to bring credibility to the school for prospective families so that they know that there's a vetted program that they can trust teaching their kids. There's an outside licensing agency that comes and does a review of the school, reads through the curriculum, watches classes, talks to all the different people around the school, teachers, students, parents.
And it's really, I should say, it's really a comparative thing. So it's not so much that this school is excellent, it's that this school is like all these other schools. That's really what accreditation says. It says that all these other schools that you've heard about, this school is another one, kind of those.
Right. And so Father Mark and I have both been part of accrediting reviews before. I've done them both for the schools I've worked for. And I've been on visiting teams going to help other schools get accredited. And on the family side, it reassures interested families, this place is legit. The other side is for colleges reviewing resumes and applications. It's a kind of technology, right? That accreditation stamp is a shorthand that says, hey, this school is legit. You can accept their students. Our program is pretty alternative in some ways. And when you're looking at accreditation standards from, whether it's the Virginia Association of Independent Schools or the National Association of Independent Schools or SCL, the Society for Classical Learning, these accrediting agencies have lists of standards, and you are supposed to show that you match up or meet all of these standards in order to get the accredited stamp. And it's not a bad thing, but our program is alternative enough that we are trying to find some really good ways to show both colleges and families the distinctives of our program, the things that are unique and challenging and wonderful, while still maintaining our autonomy over the curriculum. Our pedagogy is pretty different than a lot of schools, our routine and all of that. Right now, we are not pursuing accreditation with any of those agencies, but the conversation's still open. At some point in the future, we might find one of those groups that sees what we're doing and says, hey, we want to help you guys get accredited, and we understand what's unique about you all. Right now, we're still looking into that, but the important thing for us is that our program has its own power and its own argument for itself and for its own sake, so that technology of the accreditation stamp isn't quite as important for us.
Well, and I think what is going to draw both families to our school and will also help our students stand out as they're applying to colleges is not that we're the same as a set of other schools, but actually it's the uniqueness of what we're doing. We have model schools that are similar to us, and we're doing a lot of things that are the same as other wonderful classical schools. But the things that set us apart, I think, are the things that are going to draw people to us. I also think that, especially on the family side, parents who send their kids to us are going to vet us more deeply than the vast majority of people would vet a day school, because it's a big act of trust. And so the accreditation stamp is just not especially relevant. And on the college side, again, we're not an elite college prep school. If your number one goal is to get your kid into an Ivy League school, you probably shouldn't send them to St. Dunstan's, because you'll be annoyed with us, because that's not our number one goal. Having said that, I do actually think that a boy who comes out of St. Dunstan's is going to have a much different experience to narrate than most students, and that will set him apart in ways that I think will be appealing to a lot of schools. One thing I will say, we are a curriculum school with Hillsdale College's K through 12 education office. And what that means is that our scope and sequence is going to be similar in a lot of ways to a lot of classical schools that are out there. We're modifying it for our own needs and for our own program. But there's a similar base that we're starting with. It's just that the mode of delivery that we're giving is going to be a little bit different, and maybe we'll talk more about that.
Yeah. I have a question specifically for you, Thomas. In the day in which we live, unfortunately, protection of kids is a big thing. Will teachers, people involved in the school, will they have to go through a set training or something, and like background checks? How does all that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's an important question for us at St. Dunstan's, being a boarding school. It's just as much an important question for churches, for day schools. Anyone that's working with young people has to take this question really seriously, and they need to have proper training for their people. They definitely need to do full and thorough background checks on anybody, not only that's working for the school, but anyone volunteering with kids. Absolutely, that's going to be really important for us. In terms of how to do that, I think the people involved in the community need to be, vigilant and attentive to who they're working with. And we can have a really long conversation about best practices there and how you look out for the safety of adolescents. Like you said, it's a sad reality of the day that we live in, and turning a blind eye to that doesn't help anybody. Yeah, this is a big conversation for schools, especially when there are kids living on campus.
Yeah. No, I was talking to somebody that while they were in seminary had a situation, unfortunately, and an advance made on them, and just that wasn't that long ago, and I knew I was going to have you guys on, so that was something that was fresh in my mind.
Yeah, and if I can add one layer to that, my family already lives on campus. I have 7 children, and so part of our discussion as we're preparing to have faculty families and faculty children living around adolescent boys, adolescent males, part of our ongoing discussion is how do we teach the young men who are at the school how to deal responsibly with those situations, how to understand the way they are perceived by the world. Masculinity is threatening to a lot of people, and a lot of people are not going to believe the best in males once they grow up. And so the guys need to learn how to be above reproach, how to be above board with things. So there's actually a real discipleship opportunity for us to teach these young men what it means to be a man in the 21st century with all that goes with that.
No, that's good. So the next question, I'm going to put this into the next two questions, and that is talking about technology, and that's something that I know both of you can weigh in on. But I was telling somebody about your school, and this person had been homeschooled, and they don't know your school at all, but they were saying, they said this person's take on classical education or whatever is they're really good in the humanities. They're terrible in science and math. And I wondered if you could weigh in on that, and especially because this person was saying the future with AI and everything is going to be especially math and science, like coding and things like that. Will they learn any of those things? Yeah.
So a couple of things to say there. That is a really interesting question, and there's some really good stuff in there. For one thing, think about the kind of training that's required to become a math science person and the sort of careers that opens up to you. And then think about how most classical schools have paid their teachers in the past. If you have the kind of chops where you can teach calculus to young people, chances are a $30,000 a year paycheck isn't particularly attractive. So that's one thing. I'll put that on the side for a second. The other thing is about a future with AI and computer coding and jobs in that vein. One of the interesting things about AI is it means almost certainly a reduction in white-collar jobs as computers take over those jobs. And coding is one of the interesting things that computers actually tend to be pretty good at. An interesting part of this conversation that AI has brought about in the last year especially is, does there need to be some kind of shift in the way we think about the economic future as we teach students in any schools, but especially in classical schools? We planned on being a good school both in the humanities and in math and science. One thing that distinguishes us from other classical schools is we actually have a sort of inverted pedagogy from the way a lot of classical schools operate. And I'll just give you one example from the way we plan to teach math. When I was in high school learning trigonometry, this is probably true for most of the listeners here. How did you learn trigonometry? In my case, my teacher who I loved, Lindsey Bain, who's my cross-country coach and my trig teacher, he got up at the whiteboard and he put the unit circle on the board. And we drilled that thing for weeks. We learned every bit of the unit circle. We memorized it. We did problems with it. We knew it inside and out by a couple of weeks. But it was all problems on a whiteboard. And after a while, you've done enough unit circle problems that suddenly anything out the window starts to look pretty interesting, right? At the end of that process, oftentimes the teacher asks, now, okay, great. We know how to do this. What could we do with it? And they start asking application questions. Maybe I'm not a great example. I was very easily distracted in high school, but at that point, I didn't really care what you could do with it. I was done with the unit circle. The sort of quintessential piece of teaching adolescents is remembering that their attention is the most valuable thing you have. Winning it is the most important thing in teaching, and keeping it is the second most important thing. And so pedagogy has to take that into account. How do you keep young people engaged in the learning process? Charlotte Mason says there's no learning except for self-learning. It's another way of saying if a student doesn't want to learn something, they won't. No one can learn it for them. So we use Thomas Aquinas' peripatetic axiom as our sort of ground zero for education. That's the idea that there is nothing in the intellect which did not begin in the senses. We learn things from the outside in, which is the reverse of the way we do school at most places. We start with a textbook and some abstractions, and then we move on to examples. I'm getting a little long-winded here, but the example from St. Dunstan's is we're doing a lot of timber framing to build our structures and to teach our boys traditional carpentry skills. And an interesting thing about timbers is they're really heavy. The timber framing is a traditional way of constructing buildings. Instead of 2x4s and stud framing from Lowe's or Home Depot, you cut down a tree, you mill it into a big 8x8 or a 6x10, something like that. And then you cut wood joinery into it, and the carpentry of the whole thing holds it together with mortise and tenon joinery. Once you've built one of these assemblies, you need to stand it up in the air. You put all the pieces together, you have to lift it up. Those are super heavy. One bent in a timber frame might weigh 1,500, 2,000 pounds. And you can either do a hand raising where you push it up in the air. It's pretty dangerous if you've got people standing underneath, or you can do what we did and you build a homemade crane and get some ropes and some block and tackle, and you lift it up in the air with everybody safely out of the way. Now, the interesting thing about that is all of these pieces of equipment have tolerances. they can break if you overload them. So for our trigonometry class, to give an example of what St. Dunstan's pedagogy looks like, instead of starting with the unit circle on the whiteboard and then asking at the end of a couple weeks, what could we do with this? We walk out to the field with one of our timber frame assemblies and we ask the guys, how are we going to get this thing up in the air? And we come up with some solutions. We get out the crane and we start talking about the rigging. And then we say, this is great, but all of these different pulleys and ropes have different weight limits. How do we know how much weight we're lifting? You're never really lifting straight up. Every piece is at a different angle. Turns out you actually have to know some trigonometry to figure out how much weight you're lifting. And you have to do volume calculations and weight calculations on the timbers. So we start out in the field and say, let's figure out how to get this thing up in the air. And then once you realize there's actually this really amazing math you can use to do this, then you can hit the pause button and start teaching the elements of the unit circle needed to figure out those problems. So we actually plan to excel in the way we teach math and science, but it's going to be a little bit off the beaten path because of our sort of poetic knowledge emphasis. Same thing with science. You start on the farm or in the garden, out in the forest, and work your way backwards towards, cellular information or soil chemistry, things like that. It's actually math and science have the most opportunity to benefit from the kind of pedagogy that we use.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You can read Shakespeare anywhere and be inspired by it. Now, I think you can read it in more beautiful places and less beautiful places, but you can be led to wonder by reading Shakespeare anywhere. But the experience of wonder in relation to trigonometry or in relation to biology, the opportunity for wonder on a farm and in a skilled trade is a lot greater. And as Thomas said earlier, part of what we think people are missing in our society, and especially youth, and especially maybe not especially boys, but boys certainly as much as girls, is a sense of wonder in God's good creation. And so the model of our school has skilled trades in mind. It has their sort of career pathways. We want to break the false choice of college or poverty, which is a truly just a false dichotomy. But what we really want to do is restore wonder. And we were talking about this on the way down. 2x4s in Home Depot or a block of cheese at your local Kroger, there actually is a lot of wonder behind those things. The kind of industrial manufacturing systems and the supply chains that get you from cow to cheese in the Kroger supermarket, or from plantation, pine, fir, whatever, to the 2x4, it is incredible. The human ingenuity behind that should inspire wonder, but there's two problems. One, the wonder is hidden because you never think about that. You just grab the 2x4, you grab the block of cheese, and you go home and do whatever you want with it. There's nothing there to lead you to wonder at how it got there. And then number two is that as great as those human systems are, much more wonderful is the divinely created system that leads from sunlight to a standing tree. That's much more wonderful. Or that leads from sunlight to milk and then to cheese. Those systems are more wonderful still than the human ingenuity that then gets it into a supermarket really well. And our boys, our children, our youth are profoundly cut off from those systems. And the cool thing is, it's really impossible. You cannot take a child and walk them in a day through the system of from plantation to Home Depot, or from factory farm to the grocery store. And if you did, there'd probably be a lot of grossness and actually horrifying things in between there. But you can, on a small scale farm and on a campus where you're harvesting your own wood, which we're doing, we're harvesting our own timbers as part of our timber management plan. We have a sawmill. We're about to, Lord willing, have a permit to actually use that sawmill. And then we're building with it. You can actually achieve that wonder really quickly. The wonder of bringing down a tree and then of bringing that tree out and using that to then further the white oak regeneration that you're seeking in that wood. So you're not just taking something out, you're actually improving your land as you're doing it. And then seeing that turned into something that you can build with and that has shelter and all that. The potential for wonder is really powerful there. I think I'll say one other thing. I know we're rambling a little bit here and maybe run out of time. Interestingly enough, we have a number of people associated or friends of the project who are in tech and software engineering. So our dairy farmer advisor is also a software engineer. And one of our board members is a leading figure in AI technology, actually. And we have another friend who is a software engineer, friend of the project. And he's a fellow parishioner at All Saints Charlottesville. And I asked him one day, I said, if a high school do wanted to do what you do, which is essentially coding and software engineering, what should they be? What do they need to learn most in high school? And he thought for a second and he said logic. And I said, oh, okay. He said, anyone can learn the language of coding. It's not that difficult. And the difference between somebody who knows coding and a great coder has nothing to do with the language of coding. It has to do with logic and understanding logical systems, essentially. And so he said that the best way is to teach them logic. And so one of our principles at St. Dunstan's is that any given success for any person at any given task is rooted first in the person and then only secondarily in the technology or the tools that they use. And so we want well-formed boys who have attention, intelligence, reason, and responsibility, and God willing, love. And those transcendental imperatives, as Bernard Lonergan calls them, those are the things that are necessary for human flourishing in any time and any place. A particular technology is what is then used by that person.
And as part of this conversation, I should say also, sometimes people read our stuff on digital poverty and the shock from seeing that our kids are not going to be using computers or iPods. It's so intense. They say, what? No computers? You guys hate technology? And we have to explain, no, we actually don't hate technology. We don't even hate computers. But there's some important facts about teenage life that everyone's got to face when we're talking about educating teenagers. For example, the average teenager right now spends 7 to 9 hours a day on screens. And if you think about the 8 hours they're spending in school and the 8 hours they should be spending sleeping, and you start adding this up, you're like, oh, there goes the day, right? So there's this tremendous opportunity cost for the growth and flourishing of a young person if all of their time is sucked into social media, YouTube, listening to pop music. And the other thing is that kind of constant consumption deadens the impulse to make and create things. So we're trying to nudge the kids and encourage them to become producers and creators rather than falling back on being just consumers of things. So just a small example, if the kids don't have their iPods or their smartphones, they're going to have no music unless they learn how to play it, unless they learn how to sing, unless they learn how to do this together. And so we're trying to orchestrate the curriculum and the sort of rule of life on campus to encourage that kind of mentality that we are responsible for creating good things, not just consuming them with the swipe of our fingers. The school, actually, I should say this also, the school have lots of technology. We live in such a computerized world that when I say technology, most people think computers, which is why we adopted the language of digital poverty, not technological poverty. We use big skill saws, and we have a really nice 58 horsepower tractor we just picked up. And we have a lot of electricity around the campus, right? There's technology everywhere. And so part of putting the computer question on pause for a little bit is we get to take a step back and look at, okay, like really, how are our lives mediated by different technologies? And when should we adopt them? And when should we maybe create some boundaries around how we use them? So it's not that we don't like technology. We love it and we use it a lot, but we want the boys to learn how to use it responsibly, which means they have to grow in wisdom before they just start doing stuff.
And if we have time, I'll say two more things, one of which is one of our other guiding principles. So one guiding principle is adolescents need independence and they need curated context. One of our other very related guiding questions is, what is a developmentally appropriate challenge for this particular person at this particular time? That's a great question to ask for any parent and for any teacher. Your goal,
for any church.
And
right?
for any church. Yeah, your goal is to always put in front of your people developmentally appropriate challenges. And so thinking pastorally, if you have a Bible study with a group of people who maybe grew up in the church, but they know nothing about Scripture, then you have to tailor your Bible study to give them developmentally appropriate challenges. If you, on the other hand, you have a bunch of seminary grads and you try to teach the same way, they won't be challenged at all. And so figuring that out is the challenge, if you will. And so one of the things that I think is becoming really clear, it's been clear for a long time, but it's becoming undeniable, is that as a culture, we have given our young people developmentally inappropriate challenges in giving them access to social media and to smartphones. That is pretty now, I would say, universally undeniable that it is bad for young people to have unmediated access to social media and to smartphones. That's a developmentally inappropriate challenge. They are not if we are hardly capable of it as adults, many of us just aren't, and our youth certainly aren't. And on the other hand, we've kept developmentally appropriate challenges away from young people. So we, with the well-meaning mantra of safety first, we don't let anyone take any risks or face any challenges in the physical world. And so we want to reverse that. We want to give adolescent boys developmentally appropriate challenges, and we want to keep from them developmentally inappropriate challenges. And we just believe that a freshman in high school is not developmentally ready for the challenge of a smartphone in his pocket. One anecdote, a family psychologist who would often come to the school where we taught, or occasionally anyway, as a kind of expert, was asked by parents, because he loves to talk about developmentally appropriate challenges. Okay, so given that, when is the right time to give my child a smartphone? I'm trying to figure out when is the right time developmentally appropriately. And he said, rather scandalously, the right time to give your child a smartphone is when you are ready for your child to encounter hardcore pornography. And when they're ready for that, that's a developmentally appropriate challenge, you give them the smartphone. And if they're not ready, if that's not a developmentally appropriate challenge, then maybe don't give them that. The second thing to say, and I'll keep this one shorter, is that our boys come to us as freshmen, and they're going to go home 3 times a year for about 6 weeks. So they're going to spend the normal 3 months at home, but it's going to be interspersed throughout the year. And we want to do that because we want them to go home 12 times during their high school career. We want them to be coming in and out of the St. Dunstan's community and life, because we want to narrate their 6 weeks at home away from St. Dunstan's as a chance to consider, what is it about the St. Dunstan's life that you want to carry with you outside of St. Dunstan's? Because if you don't carry it with you when you spend your 6 weeks at home, you won't after you graduate. So if you never say morning prayer during your 6 weeks off, what you're saying is, I'm never going to say morning prayer when I graduate. And if you spend your 6 weeks completely addicted to your screens, that's what you're saying you're going to do when you graduate. What we want to give those boys, who again are coming to us as 9th graders, as digital natives already, we want to give them something that their peers don't have. Like their peers, they will experience quote unquote normal American life and all its frenetic, ascetic, distracted ethos. So they'll know what it's like to watch TV and to be on computers. We want to give them something that their peers won't have, which is the experience of a life without the distractions of screens and without social media. That's something that everyone who is over the age of 35 maybe, can remember growing up with. But a lot of these people don't recognize that people under the age of about 30 did not ever have that experience and don't. And we take it for granted that we can compare life with the screen and life without the screen, life with social media and life without, and our children can't. So that's part of our vision for digital poverty.
That's great. My wife heard you speak at the women's retreat last year, and she came home and she said, if we had that opportunity to send our boys, to quote the eminent theologian Chris Farley, we would have sold everything and lived in a van down by the river, because I think it's great. And the challenges that young people have, you hear it all the time. When I was a kid, we had this. The challenges are much greater, and I think there is a real, how do I say this? There is a warfare going on for the souls of our kids, and especially our boys. And as they're trying to develop and figure out what a man is, what does this look like? Everything's against them culturally. So last question, if people wanted some resources to think about some of this and to be able to prayerfully consider, maybe even if they have kids, maybe in middle school or something, but they're thinking, okay, this might be an option down the road or something. What resources do they have, and what are some things that you would give them as something that they could tangibly read, look at, study, pray about?
I'll try to keep this list short, but there are a couple that I would say are just great starting points. Jason Craig wrote a book called Leaving Boyhood Behind. It's just a phenomenal look at boys and rites of passage from a Christian perspective based out of the Gospel of Luke and Jesus' coming of age in Luke chapter 2. There's another book by Anthony Esselin called Defending Boyhood, How Building Forts, Playing Catch, Praying to God, and Singing Songs Can Change Your Life, something like that. The subtitle's great. If Father Mark and I have been talking about a few other books that are written from a less explicitly Christian perspective, but are really helpful guides to what's going on with adolescence right now. There's one called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt that is just eye-opening for those who don't work with teenagers frequently. I'd strongly recommend that one. What are some other ones we've been reading, Father Mark?
Another one that I would recommend as a source of data, even though I don't agree with a lot of the author's premises and conclusions, is Richard Reeves' Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling and What to Do About It, something like that for the subtitle. Leonard Sachs has an older book that is, really, it's amazing because it's pre-smartphone, pre-social media. He's really focused on video games there. But Leonard Sachs' Boys Adrift is really good. He has another good book called Girls on the Edge, or Girls on the Brink. I think it's On the Edge. That's also worth reading as well. One of the things that I'll say that's really interesting is that just in the 2 years that I've been following the St. Dunstan's Project and now participating formally in it, the conversation has changed a lot. So a lot of the things that we were saying about boys in education 2 years ago were a little bit fringe and a little bit weird. And Richard Reeves' book, he's an economist with the Brookings Institution. His book was not exactly a bestseller, but the way that I like to put it is that anybody who writes for The Atlantic or The New Yorker or The New York Times read it. And so it's mainstreamed the conversation that has been undeniable for decades, which is why are boys falling so far behind in school and now increasingly in the workplace and in overall health outcomes. So that book's really helpful for opening your eyes if you're still naively thinking that boys, by virtue of being boys, somehow have privilege in our society, and they do in certain ways, of course, but in other ways one thing I will just point out is that the difference between boys and girls educationally, between men and women educationally, the gap now is wider than any other demographic gap. So it's wider than the racial gap, it's wider than socioeconomic gaps, it's wider than geographic gaps. So,
and one of Reeves's staggering statistics is that the gender gap in education now is greater than it was when Title IX came out, but in the opposite direction. Yeah, gap in bachelor's degrees achieved. Mm-hmm. And that gap is growing greatly, whereas almost every other gap, not all of them, but is narrowing. So it's an ongoing crisis. The other one that's changed is, again, the conversation around screens. I say that this year is the first year I felt hopeful about the trajectory of American culture and American schooling around screens and social media, because it's becoming kind of widespread recognition that this is not good. It's a little bit of a silver lining behind a cloud, or maybe, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but the reason that the trajectory is good is because we might have hit rock bottom in certain ways and it's become undeniable. But that is still helpful. So that conversation's changed a lot. The third conversation that we are at the heart of in a lot of ways is the conversation around college and skilled trades. And I would say that conversation has been changing, but is still not quite as far along. But a great book for that is Shop Class's Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. Or Orrin Cass. I actually haven't read this book yet, so I'm recommending it based on interviews with Orrin Cass. I think there's two of them, The Future of the American Worker or it's The Once and Future Worker, something like that talks a lot about the real apocalypse that's coming is not that we're going to be short on coders, because we won't, but we're going to be short on plumbers and electricians and mechanics. Those are facing a demographic cliff. And again, we're not a vocational tech school. We're not a trade school, but we are going to introduce them to that life, and we're going to help them see that not only is that a good life to live if that's what you feel called into, but it is also a lucrative life to live. Father Miller, can I add two more?
Sure.
So for big picture, there's a fantastic book on liberal arts education called The Liberal Arts Tradition by Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain. And it's a good book for just an overall really thorough, wonderful written explanation of what classical schooling is. Particularly the first two chapters are relevant to what we're doing at St. Dunstan's Academy. They're on gymnastic and poetic education and what it means to re-engage students in their bodies and their senses with what they're doing. And then there's another book that's a little more narrow, but on the same line of thinking, by James Taylor, not the singer. James Taylor wrote a book called Poetic Knowledge that's an investigation into the kind of pedagogy that has been around forever. He starts with Plato, explaining how the tradition has developed since then. But it's a kind of pedagogy that we are trying to use at St. Dunstan's Academy, and there's a lot of really good, exciting explanation of how that works in that book.
Excellent. So last thing, if people want to find out more about St. Dunstan's, whether it's they want to contribute to this, they want to volunteer, or they're looking at possibly this as a real possibility for their kids or grandkids or whatever, where should they go? Who should they talk to?
They can go to our website, stdunstansacademy.org, and there's a contact us button at the bottom of the homepage. If they fill in their information with that button, it'll kick an email over to me and to Father Mark, and we'll get in touch with them.
You guys can sign up for our newsletter there. We send out a newsletter every other month, and we've had some pieces about us and by us in Christianity Today and First Things as well. So if you search St. Dunstan's Academy at those places, you'll find those. They should be able to find them.
Great. Thank you both for coming. This has been great resources, great discussion, and look forward to having you guys on again.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was a very good episode. We appreciate you being here. If you have any questions or comments or would like to learn more, please email us at podcast@anglicanprovince.org or podcast@stphillipsblacksburg.org, and we will address those questions. Thanks so much. Have a great day.